With this video, we're going to be looking at Chapter 11, which is Intelligence, Part 2. So we're looking at testing and test construction. The objectives for this will be to look at culture again, understand standardization, reliability, validity, the normal curve, and then extremes of intelligence. So when we look at the beginning of modern intelligence testing, it starts with Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon in France, and what they were trying to do was they were trying to predict children's progress in the Paris school system. So they were trying to identify kids that needed special attention, either within the classroom or to be pulled out of the classroom. They never made an assumption about the origin of intelligence, and they were actually nervous that their work could possibly have negatives on down the road. So what they did was they created the term mental age, which is the chronological age that typically corresponds to a level of performance. So a 10-year-old whose score indicates the mental age of a 12-year-old performed like a 12-year-old, a typical 12-year-old. So that's where they get the mental age from. From there, it progressed to Louis Terman in 1916 at Stanford University, who created the Stanford-Binet scale, which was an update to, obviously, the Binet-Simon scale. And from this, the biggest thing that we get is the intelligence quotient, or IQ. And that is the mental age divided by the chronological age and then multiplied times 100. So this is really where we get the IQ scores. And what's nice about it was that it allowed children of different ages to be compared, but there's also a lot of negatives to it as well. Also, there was no scale that really helped or dealt with adults either for IQ. So there needed to be some changes, but in looking at this, you can see some examples at the bottom. But a 10-year-old whose performance resembles that of a typical 12-year-old has an IQ of 120. So 12 divided by 10 times 100. So I would be able to do that calculation. From there, we go to David Welchler, and this is the most commonly used intelligence scale today. And it's the WAIS, which is tied to adults, but there's also a children and adolescent scale as well. So he looked at lots of different items that relied a little bit less on verbal ability than previous tests. And it provides separate scores of verbal intelligence and nonverbal or performance intelligence as well. So then your final score gives an overall intelligence score. This is based on a normal distribution, so the thing that we learn about here is that bell-shaped curve, which you'll see in a second. These are some examples of the WAIS test items that you might see. So on the left-hand side, you can see some just general verbal test questions. Near the bottom, you see performance questions. And then on the right side, you see a little bit more of analytical questions. So let's get back to that normal distribution. What it is a symmetrical bell-shaped curve that represents how something like IQ is distributed in a large population. So this is what we're going to tend to see. It's called the normal curve. In this scoring system, the mean IQ is set at 100. Mean is another word for average. So the average IQ score is set at 100, and the standard deviation is set at 15. The test is created so that about 2/3 of the people will score within one standard deviation of the mean, or as we'll see in a second, between an IQ or intelligence score of 85 to 115. On the Welchler test, the IQ score reflects where a person falls in that normal distribution. So we're going to look at that kind of visually so we can better understand it. First of all, in terms of the test construction, the test has to be standardized, which means it's given to a population of people so that we can figure out what our mean is, what our statistical mean is, and then it falls along the bell-shaped curve from there, or the normal curve. And we'll talk about standardization in a little bit. So like I said previously, this is what a normal curve looks like. So you can see the 100 down here. So that's our mean. That means that 50% of people are going to score along this line. So one standard deviation away would be 15 points, right? So that's where we get our 85 or 115, right, from 15 points. So 68% of people score within 15 points above or below 100, which again is that average. And then you can see that it only continues to go out from there. So we'll look at the next one. About 95% of all people fall within 30 points of that mean, of that average. One more thing to note with the normal curve and intelligence testing is something known as the Flynn effect. And this is a phenomenon that they can't really figure out an explanation for right now. But what they do is every few years they tend to, or they usually standardize the tests. So what they're finding with the Flynn effect is that mean or that average seems to be getting higher every time they standardize the test. So there are lots of factors that could influence that. One of the theories is, well, it must be nutrition, and another theory is possibly that it's just tied to education and people getting smarter and things like that. So there are lots of different theories about why our entire intelligence scale is shifting upward over the years. But that's known as the Flynn effect, which you should be aware of. So how can a test be used to compare individuals then? A standardized test, like I said previously, they're going to administer it to a group of people. They're going to use uniform procedures so that it cuts out anything that could influence the test score, so that the environment is totally the same. And they're going to use norms then when scoring the test. So that's going to provide information about how a person's test score compares with the scores of other test takers. And then you're going to get a percentile score. So you can kind of see the example down here. It says, for example, if someone answered 20 items correctly in a 30-item test, their raw score is 20. You consult the test norms and you find that a raw score of 20 corresponds with a percentile score of 90. This means that you scored the same or higher than 90% of people who took the same test. So that can help you understand something like the WKCE, where you get a percentile score back. There are different types of tests. You've taken aptitude and achievement, I'm sure by now. You might even have taken speed and power. Aptitude tests are things like the ACT, where it's trying to show us what your potential is in the future. Achievement tests are going to measure what you've learned or accomplished. So that could just be like a typical unit test. It could even be like the AP Psych test. A speed test consists of a large number of questions in a short amount of time, and the goal is to see how quickly somebody can solve a problem. And then a power test is to gauge the difficulty level of problems that an individual can solve. So power tests consist of items that increase in difficulty levels as you go. For these, I just really know aptitude and achievement for the AP test. So how do we measure individual differences? You need to be familiar with validity and reliability. Validity is a test's ability to measure what it's supposed to measure. So that makes sense. If I give you a test, I want it to measure what it's supposed to measure. So ways to test for validity, there's predictive validity, which is a measure of your future performance. So the test should predict that future performance in some way. Content validity, each item is representative of the larger body of knowledge, and it must reflect the entire range of the material. So for example, the AP exam, each item they pick should be representative of a larger body of knowledge, which would constitute mastery. And then the last one is face validity, and that measures whether a test actually tests what it's supposed to. And this one's a little bit controversial, and they have been working on this more so with standardized tests that we administer to all different school kids. So if a test is written in German, it has no face validity, right? Because you might know the content, but you can't access it because you don't know the language, unless for some reason you speak German. Reliability then is just consistency. So over time, will that test give the same result if you take the test at different times? So that might be the ACT for you. They want to see reliability each time you take the ACT, so they don't want to see you getting a 19 one time and a 25 another time, and then, a 21. They would like to see consistency in those test scores. So some things that you can do is test, retest, where people get approximately the same score when you take the test more than once, which is what I just talked about. Or there's split half reliability, and that's where a test is split into two parts, and your scores on both halves are compared. So you could do like odds and evens, or the first half and the last half, in order to do the split half reliability. One more thing of note would be that today intelligence tests are proven reliable. They're also valid, but to clarify that, they're valid measures of the kind of intelligence necessary to do well in academic work. But in a broader sense, their validity might be questionable. Okay, so kind of like we talked about before with Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, or with somebody like Daniel Goldman's emotional intelligence, or things like that. We need to take into account all different types of intelligence when we look at these things, not just academic intelligence. So finally, then our last thing we're going to look at will be the extremes of intelligence, the low and the high. Here's the low extreme. Mental retardation or intellectual disability, for example, Down syndrome, would be an IQ of 70 or below. But just because you get a 70 or below and receive this label of intellectual disability or mental retardation doesn't mean that that's going to look quite the same from 70 on down to 0. So you can see that I kind of showed you a chart of the demands of life here listed based on what your score would be: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. The final thing then would be the highs, which we call giftedness. A minimum IQ is about 130 in order to be considered gifted. Some of you might be in the gifted and talented program here at school. And researchers also recommend not to put too much weight on IQ. It shouldn't be the only factor of whether or not you enter into a gifted and talented program. It's about the top 3 to 5% in schools, but that varies quite a bit. And then I think that some of the rest of this is kind of interesting. A lot of the kids selected for these school programs don't actually make genius-like contributions. And it's because high intelligence alone usually isn't what makes us great. You need a combination of high intelligence, high creativity, and high motivation. And then also, I would just say, what about things like savant syndrome, which we talked about in the previous video, or autism, right? So these people might score low in intelligence tests and receive those low numbers, yet they are off the charts in some area like dates or math or something like that. So those are just things to keep in mind. And as we kind of bring that whole thing to a close, just a reminder that when you talk about these labels, intelligence labels can be kind of dangerous. Those numbers can be dangerous. You guys know when somebody says, oh, did you get on the ACT? If you did really well, sure, you might want to brag about it, but at the same time, you don't want to make them feel bad if they didn't do as well. Or you don't want to say, oh, I didn't do that well, and then you tell them the score you got, and then they did even worse. So these numbers and these labels can be a little bit dangerous. So just a quick check. I'll just have you guys read through some of these questions. What would be true of a thermometer that always reads 3 degrees off? So pick your answer here quick before we move on to the next one. The Flynn effect refers to the All right, choose your answer before we move on. The most widely used modern intelligence test was developed by. Choose your answer before we move on. Students who do well on college entrance exams generally do well in college. This helps establish that these exams have. Choose your answer. The purpose of Alfred Binet's early intelligence test was to. Choose your answer. The intelligence quotient compares a child's. Choose your answer. Children are said to have an intellectual disability if they have difficulty adapting to the demands of independent living and have IQ scores below. And choose your answer. All right, just